All right, so in this video, Dion's gonna go over findings from the report called Meeting the Childcare Challenge, Opportunities for Economic Development Districts. The report examines the drivers of these challenges and the impacts it's had in communities across the country, and it highlights roles that economic development districts are playing to increase childcare accessibility, quality, and affordability in their communities. So I'm gonna put a link to that report in the chat, and then we'll kick it over to Dion to explain more. So here I'm going to share my screen and y'all should be able to see and hear this. So let me know if you're not.
Organizations. I want to thank Jeff.
Go ahead. There you go.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dion Thompson Davily. I'm a program manager with the National Association of Development Organizations. I want to thank Jess for inviting me to speak on this webinar, and I regret that I'm not able to join live. The topic that I'm going to cover for us this morning is childcare and economic development, which is a frame that NATO has been using as we've published a series of resources over the past half year or so aimed at our audience of regional development organizations, economic development districts, councils of government, and other regional actors who are engaging with this issue from that particular lens. You'll have to bear with me as I try to make this technology work. I haven't used it before. As I mentioned, in the past half year, NATO has focused on childcare as an economic development issue, and we've published a series of resources, including a report, several case studies, two webinars, which are recorded and available on our website, and a number of conference sessions that tackle this issue again from that regional perspective. We found that there is something of a gap of for resources that are aimed at regional stakeholders like regional development organizations that focus on childcare and particularly have this frame. So our work has aims to kind of fill that gap and to share resources that can spark ideas among our audience or help to promote effective policies in other ways. We've chosen the economic development lens because I think it's become increasingly clear to many stakeholders in the economic development and regional development space that you can't think of childcare anymore solely as a siloed social services or family policy issue because it interacts with the economy in a number of ways and has huge implications for regional development. The top line numbers that I have here just kind of attempt to get at this frame. That figure 122 billion drawn from a recent think tank report. It has they get to that number through a variety of different calculations. The biggest one, of course, is the impact to the workforce. And so if you're an employer and your employees aren't coming into work, or if you have trouble recruiting employees because they can't find somewhere stable to care for their kids, obviously that's a huge economic challenge. It's one that's been growing in recent years. The childcare industry was significantly impacted by the COVID pandemic and is still recovering in many ways. And so there's this huge workforce challenge, but then of course there's other angles to the economic development frame here. One is simply that the childcare sector is a massive industry in the United States with a huge workforce that that interact with local economies in important ways. And then finally, if you take economic development, one aspect of it being quality of life, people's quality of life is significantly impacted when they are unable to find care or are unable to find care that they can afford. This has long run consequences for families, for people in their professional lives, and for children who, really benefit from having stable long term care situations. So most of the presentation that I'm going to give here is going to focus on the report that we put out, and I think is a really useful intro into this subject. We have three parts. The first tries to untangle why this is a challenge, an issue, a crisis. There many different words have been tossed out at all. Like, why isn't this just a normally functioning sector of the economy, like, the public school system or something like that. And we dig into the different cost drivers here and how they've changed over time and why they've all added up to a sector where no one's happy. The second part looks at some regional programs that have been enacted in the past. I had the chance to interview about a dozen leaders from regional development organizations and economic development districts to talk about programs that they've run and get some lessons from what their successes and failures in operating those programs have been. And then the third section, again drawn from those interviews, is a series of recommendations for how you can get involved in this space as a regional entity, whether that's a coalition of regional organizations or a single organization, how you can start to make an impact in your own community. And I think one of the big lessons that I drew from writing this report is that this childcare is not a core focus area for any type of regional organization that we work with. So there are federal programs that flow through regional organizations, like workforce development boards and area agencies on aging come to mind, but there isn't a big pile of federal money that's being shoveled through this ecosystem. Uh, so there are approaches that you can take. There are programs that you can run or participate in, but of course, this is not going to be a core focus of any organization. And so it has to be understood from that perspective. So, why is this a crisis? Like, the first thing to understand is that none of the actors in this sector are particularly happy. So, if you look at it from the perspective of families, the cost of care has been rising faster than wages and inflation for more than a decade. These numbers on screen kind of give you a sense of this is like a serious part of families' budgets now, and perhaps not a sustainable one in many cases. And that's why you see people say they would be in the workforce more if they could find care they can afford, or they've had to drop out of the workforce entirely, or they've had trouble at work because they've had unexcused absences, etc. I was actually looking for childcare last year for infant care, and some of the numbers that were quoted to me were absolutely eye-watering. Particularly in higher cost of living places, these costs can really grow. From the perspective of workers in the childcare industry, wages are quite low. Benefits are sparse. What what researchers have found, I think, is that the median childcare worker is paid a very similar wage to people who work in retail or food service. And of course, being a childcare worker is rewarding in its own way, and many people feel a calling to it. But you can't escape the reality that it is a physically demanding and emotionally demanding job. For that reason, like the low wages really have created this situation where there's high turnover in the workforce, and that's challenging both from the perspective of providers trying to keep their workers, and I think just like normatively, parents really want their children and anyone who has a stake in the well-being of children want the people who are caring for them to be established in their careers, to be stable over time and to be compensated fairly. From the provider perspective, unfortunately, like parents are paying a lot, workers are not making a lot of money, but providers aren't, getting rich either. Their revenue, of course, is really capped by affordability, particularly in the market-based childcare sector where there's no federal or state subsidies flowing in to help them. Uh, there's few opportunities for economies of scale in the childcare sector, which I will get into soon. And there's this particular problem where because many of these operators are small, if they have just a couple of slots unfilled or a couple of employee slots unfilled for an extended period of time, it's very difficult to make ends meet. And so just like there's a lot of turnover among workers, there's an enormous amount of churn on the provider side in this sector. Why are costs such a challenge? I broke out six different factors that all add up to to give you the full picture here. The first and most important is labor costs. Labor is the dominant share of costs for any childcare provider, and unfortunately is hard to economize on because, as I said a second ago, there are no returns to scale in the sector. There are few productivity gains over time, unlike, most sectors of major sectors of the economy where one employee can do more over time with technological assistance or innovation in processes. Childcare workers, their productivity is flat. Partially that's because of regulatory policy. Like there's limits on how many children a staff member can care for, which I think, everyone supports. That's not controversial in any way. That's not going to be the fix. But it's something like three infants or four infants to one provider, or six or eight toddlers, depending on the state. And so, if labor is your major cost and labor cannot do more, it's just very difficult to improve on costs there. Then insurance and liability costs, because childcare workers are dealing, with the most vulnerable members of our society. There's quite high premiums for insurance and regulatory requirements that stack onto that. Again, those are areas where it's difficult to see opportunities for innovation or even for assistance from, policymakers that we all, that's like a win from all perspectives. Facility costs, I think, are worth mentioning really briefly. It's expensive to build out a space to run a childcare center for regulatory compliance reasons. You need a kitchen, you need special security features, etc. And then because parents really want to find care near where they live or near where they work, and it's difficult to differentiate yourself as a childcare operator, the most common way that they compete is by location, and so location driven rents are a major factor that operators have to consider. Finally, the churn issue gets to these last two categories. So if you have a lot of worker turnover, you'll find yourself paying to recruit new employees, to train those employees. That can be quite costly. You will also find yourself, if you have slot turnover, if you are, well, okay, a better way to explain this is like if you are a small operator and just one or two slots are empty, your margins go negative, and you may so it's really important that you fill those slots. So operators will spend a lot of money on marketing to families to make sure that slots don't stay open for very long. So all of this adds up to a cost structure that is difficult to improve on and quite challenging for families and workers. The next part of the report looks at four different areas where RDO programs have made some kind of impact in their regions. The two most common are on the left here. I have research and planning and regional convenings. Many of the regional organizations we work with have a planning office or planning expertise or close relationships with planning consultants. And so bringing those tools to bear in service of a community in their region or the region as a whole is a natural fit. Moreover, I think if you just look at this structurally, labor markets and housing markets, which are the two things that impact people's access to childcare most, are regional in scope. And so if you're looking at just one jurisdiction's childcare sector, you might not get a full picture of whether parents can access and afford care, whether there, are care slots outside of your city boundaries, but a 5 minute drive away. Like, so just looking at this from the regional perspective is quite helpful in many cases. The other major area is convenings. This tends to be a core strength of regional organizations and coalitions like the ones who I assume are on this call right now. But convenings are a particularly fruitful way, I think I've heard, to begin to have an impact in the childcare space, both because there are things that stakeholders can do together in coalitions to improve access, to solve coordination problems, etc. And because kind of uniquely, at least from the perspective of a lot of people that I spoke to, there's a unique level of interest from the business community in this issue compared to other economic development issues. It's a challenge that, particularly as businesses scale up, they face every day, of workers, not being able to come in for their shifts, or of having trouble recruiting workers, because of inadequate access to childcare, among other issues. And and the business community, many companies want to make an impact, but aren't sure exactly where they can most effectively engage. There's not, depending on the state, there's not necessarily a perfect mechanism. So it's easy to engage business leaders to come to these meetings and to talk with other stakeholders and providers and nonprofit leaders about how they can coordinate to better support their workforce. These other two, you'll hear more about physical development from Frontier Community Resources, who's on the call this morning. But particularly in more rural and smaller contexts, nonprofit operators, like, can really benefit from support from regional organizations, and there's a number of stories in this report and in our case studies about cases where that has happened. And then finally, income support programs I included because there's a couple of cool examples, mostly in the state of Iowa, about how you can reduce that turnover in the sector, of course, by improving the wage situation. But really, those two upfront, research and planning and regional convenings, they're core areas of expertise for regional organizations, and they are much needed, according to stakeholders who want to hear this lens, childcare and economic development. The final section that I have in the report is just some simple advice gleaned again from those conversations about different ways that you can engage in this sector to begin to understand both the needs of families and communities, and providers and workers, and to make an impact, even if that's a limited one on one particular project. So that is all I have. The report is available on NATO's website, as are all of our other resources, and I'm sure we'll include them in the chat here and in any follow-up from this webinar. If you want to hear more from NATO about childcare, the best way to do that is to reach out to us, or to sign up for our newsletter, nato.org/subscribe. It comes out once a week, and it's aimed at our particular audience, our members, but also has many resources that are relevant to the practice of regional planning, regional governance, regional economic development, and all the different things that happen at that unique scale. So I'd really encourage you to sign up. And that is all I have. Again, I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank the Recompete Community of Practice for inviting me to speak to you all. And I hope you enjoy the rest of this webinar and the rest of your days. Thank you.
All right, so that was Dion Thompson Davily. Like I had mentioned, he is no longer at NATO,
Good
but
morning.
wish him the best. And like he had said, to reach out to NATO if you do have any other questions. I will go ahead and put the link to that report that he was speaking about in the chat. He is also on LinkedIn, and I think he probably would be happy to connect if y'all want to find him there. And so next up, I'm going to pass to Dr. Michelle McFarlane to talk about one of those case studies that Dion mentioned. And then after that, we're going to open up for discussion and Q&A. So as Michelle is presenting, please, have your get your questions ready, talk about what's going on in your community. I'll just give a quick introduction to Michelle again. Michelle is the Director of Community and Economic Development for Frontier Community Resources. And she's going to share information about the impetus, strategy behind some of the financing of the implementation of the Lincoln County Youth Center to help close a childcare gap in their community. And like I said, then we'll have a discussion. So please be prepared to ask questions of Michelle. We didn't talk about this earlier, Michelle, but I feel like I always encourage people to ask nitty-gritty questions. Y'all are all practitioners interested in this space, and to share your experiences as well. So I will pass it on to you, Michelle, and thanks for being here with us.
Thanks so much for the invitation. I'm going to share my screen. So the Lincoln County Youth Center came out of a lot of very creative people and a lot of hard work. And so to give you some context, Frontier Community Resources is the U.S. Department of Commerce's Economic Development Administration designated economic development district for South Central Idaho. Idaho is broken out into 6 economic development districts, and we are this blue district down at the bottom. There are 5 other economic development districts within the state. This white area of the state is not currently have an economic development district, and so we do a lot of work in that area to support those communities. To give you some context, our region is about 11,500 square miles. That's comparable to the size of Belgium. So for me to go from where I'm based in Twin Falls upwards to the top of our communities, it's several hour drive to offer them support. Our regional population is about 222,000 in that entire area. And it ranges in county anywhere from 1,300 in our smallest community to 97,000. We have 34 cities, but we only have one metropolitan area, and that's the city of Twin Falls, which only became a metropolitan area about 5 years ago, and it sits at about 55,000. So we tend to be a very rural communities. We're speaking specifically about Lincoln County. And Lincoln County is here in the center of our region. It's about 1,200 square miles, which is about the size of Rhode Island. But within that, there are only 3 very small communities, Shoshone, Dietrich, and Richfield. And they range in population anywhere from 324 in Dietrich to the very large city of Shoshone at 1,800. The entire county is only populated by about 5,500 people. So it's very rural, but there's a high number of children within the community. About 50% of residents are within the labor force. There's not a lot of jobs within the community. And so between 70 and 75% of the labor workforce within the county actually commutes outside of the county. And that was adding up to a lot of windshield time for parents. And what we were seeing was the need for the Lincoln County Youth Center came about in about 2019, 2020. So right around the time of COVID, the only child care facility within the county closed in 2020. And at the same time, the county commissioners identified that they were having a significantly higher rate of teen pregnancy and juvenile vandalism and crime. And they were seeing more and more parents exiting the workforce because they simply had nowhere for their children to go. And school-aged children were spending a lot of time after school getting in trouble because there was nothing for them to do. There's a beautiful park in Shoshone, but for teenagers, hanging out at the park can often be a bad thing. So they were their own worst enemies. The county really identified that they thought if the kids just had something to keep them busy, something to enrich their lives, things might be better off. So the county dove deep and made a commitment that this is not just a parent issue, this is a county issue because of the crime and how much the impact was having on the overall economic atmosphere. So the county worked to create a committee and they purchased this old vacant church in the city of Richfield. And they started with a lease in August of 2020. The county approved a resolution to create a youth commission that had representatives from the county commissioners as well as other stakeholders. And they entered into a 1-year lease with the church in order to take it over. They then, in January of 2021, sign an MOU in order to apply for the 21st Century Community Learning Center grant. And that MOU brought together the 3 school districts. Every one of those towns within that community has their own school district. So it's not unified, it's independent. They also brought together the city of Richfield, since that's where the building was, and Lincoln County. And Lincoln County commissioners were really the drivers behind this. They hired an engineer, and in February of 2021 received design proposals for how to remodel that church building. And they started out by submitting an application to the Idaho Community Development Block Grant Program, which is funded in part through, not in part, wholly from HUD. And in Idaho, the block grant funds are broken into different set-asides. There is a community center set-aside. So not a childcare set-aside, but a community center. But the goals beyond for that set-aside really were the same priorities of what the commissioners were trying to achieve. And they were successful in getting funding in order to renovate the building. The county was also very creative, and they reached out to AmeriCorps, and they were able to get AmeriCorps volunteers to help with clearing tumbleweeds and other weeds outside of the facility, painting, remodeling, and really standing up the after school care. The county then purchases the property in July, and in August of 2021, just 1 year later, they officially start offering preschool and after school care. And they are still very successfully operating. In fact, in October of last year, they had a ribbon cutting on a daycare facility. The church facility had one building that had been the church, and then it had a second residential building that had been the pastor's home. And so they had purchased both and had only renovated the church facility initially. And that's where the preschool and after school care was being held. And so the more successful the program was, they realized they needed more than just preschool and after school care. They really needed daycare for working parents. And so they worked on renovating the pastor's home and had their ribbon cutting on that one for the daycare. This program is almost 100% grant funded or funded through donations of the community and volunteers. They work to keep their prices fairly low. Full day daycare is $450 a month, which is dirt cheap, frankly. The preschool kids can go 2 to 4 days a week. It's 10 to 1, and it's $10 a day. The after school program for grades K-5 runs from 4 to 6 p.m. They even bus the children from the different school districts to the facility. And then they have teen time for grades 6 through 12. The after school care and the teen time are completely free. So parents can have their children bused from the school to the facility, and they are providing them a snack, they're providing them activities. During their summer activities, they are taking them on field trips to the local lake to go swimming. Their teen during the summer did field trips that they learned about all of the local amenities. They went to the rec center, they went to the local government to learn how to get a driver's license and to talk to the county commissioners. So they're really working to make this an enriching experience. It's not sit your kid in front of a TV. It's very much a enrichment educational experience. They're helping with homework. There's lots of physical activities. So the center is operating through a grant from the Idaho Workforce Development Council, a lot of donations, particularly from the community. One very generous community member actually donated a manufactured home that they were able to auction off in order to receive proceeds. And they have the 21st Century Learning Grant. That actually was a little bit of a stressor on the community last July when a lot of grants were being frozen and pulled back. The Lincoln County Youth Center was actually on the verge of having to close their doors in August of last year. Thankfully, the Idaho Department of Education stepped in and provided funding until the 21st Century Learning Grants came back online at the federal level. But it's an example of this is an incredible service, but the directors are having to daily find financial opportunities in order to keep it going. And an example of that is in March, the county commissioners received $50,000 from the Idaho Energy Efficiency and Conservation Block Grant in order to provide window replacement, building weatherization, changing out doors. And the idea is if they can help lower their energy costs with propane and electric for heating and cooling, that can help the overall budget. So this is, even though it's now stood up, it is an ongoing process in order to ensure that the funding is there to keep the cost low for the community. The real key to success for making this work was the county commissioner's ability to think outside of the box. Frontier's role in this, we are not childcare experts. We're experts in the community development block grant and other grant funding. So when the county commissioners came to us and said, we want a childcare facility, you've probably recognized there are not a whole lot of grants out there if you type in childcare grant. But if you're looking beyond just the title of what they're talking about and looking at the grant priorities and goals, a lot of times other grants will apply. So we used a community center grant in order to do the remodel because the priorities of the community center grant was to provide enrichment to youth. That's exactly what the youth center is doing. The need that parents had was childcare, but what we're able to provide is even better. So that is what I have. Are there any questions about the Lincoln County Youth Center or the process we went through?
Thanks, Michelle. I'll go ahead and get us started. And I'm also curious to hear from folks on the line about what your communities are doing right now with regard to Childcare Challenge, what you're exploring, what's working well. And Rebecca, I saw you just came off mute. Do you have a question? You want to get started?
Well, I wanted to compliment Michelle. That's really cool the way you brought all those different pieces together. I'm curious, and I don't mean for this comment to sound at all cold, but from the perspective of recompete and bringing folks off of the sidelines, daycare falls pretty far down the list of things we have to address. And one of the challenges I have found with our local folks that are working on this is I think we need to focus workforce on more, I'll say, stabilized and middle manager employees and employers versus the role it plays in recompete or prime age employment gap individuals. So I'm just curious, you did an amazing job of bringing value to the community with the youth center, but in terms of employment, where do you see the balance in that? Was it more with when you opened the daycare versus the idea of just a youth center and enriching the community?
What the county commissioners were finding was people were exiting the workforce because they were having the same problems on the job site that Dion talked about, that their kids were getting in trouble, so they were having to go to court or they were having to track their kids down. So even when they were physically there, they weren't mentally there and they weren't good employees. They were good people and they could be good employees, but they were distracted because they were worried about their kids. So the county commissioners saw this as an economic development issue, that if we want our residents to be able to be good employees, we have to take something off their plate. And by ensuring that their children have somewhere safe and enriching to be, that took some load, some stress off of the parents, and then they could be really good workers. And so it came full circle that the root of the problem was the lack of childcare rather than it just being an amenity. And that's really what had to be sold to the employers is the root of your workforce issue is not that employees don't exist, it's that the employees that exist don't have what they need to be an employee.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, Rebecca. I also wanted to say thanks to you, Michelle, for sharing kind of the good and the difficult. A huge accomplishment, like you said, but not easy, continues to take day-to-day work. Um, and so, yeah, I hope folks appreciate the that detailed look. I also loved the project timeline with the detailed information about the MOUs, the grant application, using AmeriCorps volunteers. And then, like you said, starting with an urgent problem, the youth center, and then adding on a daycare facility later. And then, like the braiding the funds, the interesting donations, like the mobile home that was, I think you said auctioned off. Was that right? That was really interesting.
They auctioned it off and it was split with 5 different nonprofits throughout the county, and the youth center was one of those recipients.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions from folks? And if not a question, maybe like a challenge or where your community is at right now with regard to addressing childcare challenges, what you're exploring. Hoping this can also be a conversation for folks to share strategies across different communities and maybe do some joint problem solving. And so I'll take a moment to pause and see if folks want to share what's going on where they live.